Everyone. This is our penultimate lecture in the social protection series here at Bread IGC. We are so grateful for everyone that's been here throughout the course, and we're really excited today to hear from Professor Edward Miguel at the University of California, Berkeley, to talk to us about spillovers and general equilibrium effects. As usual, please raise your hand if you would like to be a live participant, and we'll enable your video and microphone to ask questions during the Q&A at the end. For everyone else, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to select some of those for the Q&A as well as answer what we can during the lecture itself. Uh, the lecture recording and slides will be on the IGC website, and they will be there with all other lecture slides. Please reach out to igc.research if you have any questions. And otherwise, get your pencils ready, and we're excited now. We'll turn it over to Professor Miguel.
Great. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm excited to share this material and go through it with you all. And, very happy to have a Q&A at the end. So yeah, definitely get, write down questions, think about where you'd like some more information, and we'll, keep the conversation going. But I'll go for about an hour now with new material. So again, I'm Ted Miguel, professor at University of California, Berkeley. And I'll be talking about spillovers and general equilibrium effects. Just a little bit of overview. I think, as Caleb mentioned, we're kind of towards the end of this course, and you guys have already covered a lot of different topics and material, including some that are related to what I'm going to speak about today. There's already like several different lectures up front that deal with cash transfers and different types of transfers. So I'm, looking at lectures 3, 4, 5. Those are just, kind of directly relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, but I'll also go in some new directions. And then I think the last lecture next week will round out the course. All right. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Although I guess you can also save them for the end. So the material I'm going to talk about today is based on the chapter that was circulated to you, and it's a chapter in the Handbook of Social Protection that I wrote that came out, I guess, earlier this year. And I just want to acknowledge, my research assistant, Shea Delamy, and then some colleagues for, some very useful comments on that material up front. This course really is very closely linked to that book and all the different chapters in the book. So, it's just a great resource for understanding social protection programs in the context of development. All right. So what, my goal is today is to go beyond thinking about kind of narrow benefits of particular programs for recipients and start thinking about broader impacts for the economy, for society as a whole. That's really what sets this discussion apart. Thinking of spillover effects, thinking of general equilibrium effects. There are a lot of different types of social protection programs. As I'll tell you, I'm mainly going to focus on cash transfers here, but I'll kind of mention some others. But think about not just the type of program, but actually let's start with a discussion of the types of broader spillovers that you might imagine could be generated by a social protection program. So I'm going to talk about 3 in particular. The first one is, beyond effects on, say, a recipient themselves, there might be impacts within a household of that individual receiving a program, or of the household receiving a program that aren't like the direct effect of the program, but are really interesting. So, within household impacts are a starting point. They could come in many different forms. You could imagine that, let's say I receive some sort of, public employment program. I'm the recipient of that job. Maybe the earnings that I get and the change in my kind of attitudes or self-esteem affect my relationships with people in the household. Maybe it affects intimate partner violence. Hopefully it would reduce it, but that could be an object of study. And then again, let's say I receive this, public employment program. It might not just affect me as an individual, it could really affect other household members. Maybe it affects the schooling of my children because now I have more money. Maybe it affects their long run aspirations and so their long run labor market outcomes. So that's going to be one category of effects to think about and keep in mind, these within household impacts. But there are a couple of others that are also very important and maybe even more studied. The second type of general equilibrium effect or spillover effect are effects that are mediated through the market. And actually, I'll be spending most of my time today talking about these types of effects, number two here in the context of cash transfer programs. So again, let's say I receive, it could be, some sort of labor. Um, there's a labor subsidy. I'm hired through a public program, a social protection program. Maybe that doesn't just affect me, but it affects other local enterprises. Maybe it affects, if enough people are in this program, maybe it affects labor market outcomes and wages more broadly, or it affects enterprise profits. So there's a whole bunch of market outcomes that could be affected by a social protection program, whether that's a labor program, whether that's maybe an old age pension, whether that's a cash transfer, which is what I'm going to talk about today. The kind of most classic general equilibrium effect, of course, would be an effect on prices. And you could imagine prices both in terms of effects on prices in output markets, so goods and services that are produced, as well as prices of inputs. So that's like when I mentioned, oh, maybe this labor program affects wages, that would be an input price, labor. But that's going to be a very important effect. So even if other people are not directly benefiting from the program, even if they're not directly interacting with me as a recipient, if having a bunch of recipients in an area affects prices, that could be a really interesting general equilibrium effect. And then the third category is broader, but actually really important. Maybe in the long run, the most important out of all of these, which is when we think of a social protection program and we go beyond just the impacts on recipients, how does that program affect society as a whole? How does having an old age pension program affect the legitimacy of the state? How does it affect outcomes in, voting outcomes in a democratic society? How does the existence of an old age pension program start changing norms around care for the elderly, around other things? So you could imagine a whole range of effects of large scale social protection programs. And these are things that have been discussed and debated in rich countries over the last, century or two as they've expanded social protection programs. I think of, my own country here, in the US, the Social Security program, our old age pension program, is just incredibly important politically. The introduction of Social Security dramatically reduced poverty among the elderly. And again, changes within household dynamics between older parents and their children and their grandchildren. So in that sense, it changes culture, in the long run as well. In other societies, the existence of a large-scale social protection program could also affect important outcomes like the likelihood of armed conflict. And you might say, well, how are those connected? But there's actually some very interesting work by Timo Fetzer linking the expansion of the large scale and rega labor program, employment guarantee program in India to reduced risk of armed conflict following extreme climate shocks. So again, social protection programs could make society more resilient, could affect the likelihood of armed conflict, could affect democratic outcomes. So again, now we're thinking really big about these programs. And as you can imagine, measuring the effects on something like number three are often going to be quite challenging. In general, measuring general equilibrium effects and spillover effects is hard if we really want to identify those impacts in a credible way econometrically. It's harder to use experiments typically to do them. So to get at, say, a lot of the number three impacts here, people have relied on natural experiments. Okay, so today, as I mentioned, I'm going to focus mainly on cash transfers and category two outcomes. Although even in the paper that I'm going to mainly focus on, the Egger et al. Paper, we do talk about category one and category three outcomes to some extent. But today I'm going to mainly focus on category two outcomes, these market mediated spillovers. And what's kind of exciting and what I survey in the chapter is our study, this Egger et al., is one of just several new studies that are really tackling issues of general equilibrium effects, really at scale in development economics in a way that, 20 years ago, no one really thought we might be able to do with experiments. Again, people might have had to, rely on natural experiments for them. So what I'm going to mainly focus on is the effect of a fiscal stimulus, cash transfers designed as really a social protection program to help the poor on local multiplier effects. So that is sort of increases in local GDP, something we think of as a macroeconomic quantity in rural Kenya. If you're interested in reading more, again, refer to the chapter, but one study to look at is the Girard et al. 2024 paper in Brazil. And I think Francois has already given a lecture in this series, maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. But they actually look at something similar. They look at a large scale cash program in Brazil, and they also find evidence of these broader sort of economic benefits or multiplier style benefits in Brazil there. And there's other new work kind of doing similar things. So it's an exciting time, and I'm really happy to give this lecture to introduce you to some of these topics and ideas. What I'm not going to focus on so much today are two other major areas in the social protection area where you might imagine very important spillover or general equilibrium effects. I already mentioned labor market interventions. The Muralidharan et al. 2023 piece that I've cited there studies the NREGA employment guarantee program in India and looks at the effects on local labor markets of the expansion of that program. It's not technically the expansion in that paper. They really look at an intervention that improved implementation of the program, but really led to substantially more people getting enrolled in the program, getting employment, in rural areas in India. And they find very sizable effects, not just on the people in the program getting the jobs, but on the local labor market, on wages, on firm profits. They look at prices. It's a great paper. In these slides that I'm going to go through today, I'm not going to get all the way to the end. There's extra slides at the end that are slides on that paper. So if you're interested in that paper, in itself, I would say, grab the PDF from the website and you can see that material. But that's really a phenomenal paper that pushes things forward. And then a couple of other papers I'm citing here on labor market interventions. The Franklin et al. 2024 is another great paper from Ethiopia looking at spillovers in the labor market. And then the Briza et al. 2021, the labor rationing paper in the AER similarly. So if you're really interested in the labor area, I would say those would just be three go-to papers. And again, these slides will have some coverage of labor topics at the end of the slides, which I won't have time to go through today. And then the other area that I've talked about are old age pensions. Old age pensions are incredibly important, politically extremely important in countries that have them. But in a lot of low and middle income countries, the old age pension system is just very underdeveloped. And not just in the poorest low income African countries, but in middle income Asian countries, old age pensions are just quite underdeveloped. And this is very important because populations around the world are aging very rapidly. And so the Duhan et al. Article that I've cited here goes through the demographics that we should expect to see in low income countries, especially African countries, but makes a contrast with Asian countries. And just incredibly important, before there was a social security system in the US, the poverty rate among old people was the highest of any age group. We don't think of it that way now in rich countries because there are these well-developed old age pensions, but just widespread elder poverty was the norm in rich countries until a century ago. And I think the fear in low and middle income countries is unless there's a big expansion of old age pensions, we may see the same thing in the coming decades as the numbers of old age population double and triple in many countries around the world. Okay, so I have a discussion of that in the chapter. I'm not going to get into it. I will just say you will see a bunch of studies in the chapter referring to the expansion of old age pensions in South Africa right around the time of the end of apartheid, so about 30 years ago. And that's kind of like the best developed literature from low and middle income countries on old age pensions that I'm aware of. And they really talk about all the benefits and the impacts of the expansion of old age pensions, not just for the recipients, they certainly benefited, but also some of these category 1, 2, and 3 outcomes that I referred to. So, Esther Duflo has a very famous early paper showing that there are changes in child investments when there's an expansion of the old age pension in South Africa in a very gendered way, that when grandmothers get the pension, they tend to invest more in their granddaughter's schooling, for instance, or health. So again, I could have given this whole lecture on the labor interventions. I could have given it on the old age pensions. Super important. Hopefully you can dive into the chapter if you want to go into those a little bit more. But what I'm going to talk about today mainly is the Egger et al. Piece. Was published a few years ago in Econometrica. I'm delighted to be a co-author on this on this study. And stepping back, we're really going to focus a lot today on these type 2 outcomes, broader spillovers and GE effects of um, cash transfers. This is something that's been a major study, topic of inquiry in economics for a long time, especially in macroeconomics. We can think all the way back to famous, work by Keynes. And then I've cited a bunch of more recent papers on multiplier effects. What is the effect of fiscal stimulus, of spending on economic outcomes, beyond the recipients? Again, what are the broader, economic effects? Our goal on some level in designing this study was to try to unify micro and macro themes in development. We're going to be using an experiment that delivers cash transfers at the household level, but then we're going to try to study a macro quantity, the multiplier. Muralidharan and Niehaus have a really nice Journal of Economic Perspectives article about 8 years ago that lays out this kind of agenda. So I definitely refer you to that if you want to read more. But again, until recently, it's been hard to estimate these quantities experimentally, but now that's changing. And again, the chapter goes through some of the other papers, including that Girard et al. Piece that has a similar flavor. Okay, so cash transfers are very important. I think everybody who's here interested in social protection is going to be probably interested in cash transfers, familiar with them. It's been, a type of assistance that's become very common in recent years. During the pandemic, especially, the numbers of cash transfer programs and, transfer through mobile money or through cell phones increased dramatically. And, for a while now, because the literature goes back a couple decades, it's already been documented that there are substantial benefits for the recipients of the cash themselves. If you look at the people in an RCT, those who get cash versus a control group at the individual level or the household level, those households that get cash, they consume more, they eat more food, they accumulate more assets. There are sometimes improvements in child outcomes and health, improvements in psychological well-being. So that's kind of well understood. What's less well understood is if we're going to expand a program that's a large-scale national social protection program, what are the aggregate consequences of doing that? And it's really intuitive that there would be broader consequences, because if I get cash, how do I benefit from it in all the ways I listed here in the second bullet point? Well, I'm going to spend that money, but when I spend it, when I consume food, when I buy clothes, when I accumulate assets, that money is going to basically circulate in the economy. It's going to, I'm going to spend it at an enterprise. Then they're going to do something with it, et cetera. So, the possibility of there being multipliers is plausible, especially in a low income setting. We're going to study this in rural Kenya, especially in a low income setting where there's a very high marginal propensity to consume the cash. So again, just in your mind, think about it. Okay, imagine if there was a cash transfer. I got the cash, but I didn't really spend much of it. I behaved in the way that, if you remember Ricardian equivalence from your macro classes, I thought of this as just a shock to my lifetime wealth. I got the cash transfer. I saved it. I just consumed some small portion of it every period as I kind of spend down my wealth over my life. You might not expect as large multipliers in that case. So just keep in mind this issue of the marginal propensity to consume. It's going to be very important in this discussion. Okay, so what does this study do? And again, please write down questions, think of questions, so in the Q&A I can resolve anything, because I'm going to kind of go straight through now for another 40 minutes or so. Again, we're going to use an RCT to study aggregate effects of a large-scale cash transfer program. We worked with the NGO Give Directly on this, and they raised, once we had agreed with them to carry out this large-scale research study, they raised funds to distribute as part of this project. They raised about $11 million of funds, so it's a pretty big program. We worked across nearly all of a particular county, the rural areas in a county in Kenya, so a big population area. And this cash infusion over the peak 12 months that the cash was being distributed was something like 15 or 16% of local GDP. So to think of this as a really large shock, this is a big social protection program. You know, in the Great Recession in the US, when there was the stimulus bill and stimulus spending, it was an order of magnitude less spending than this. Maybe it was a couple percent of GDP. So this is a big shock. That's the first element that's important. The other element is in order to get at aggregate effects, we can't just randomize at the household level or even the village level. What we were able to do here, because we had such a large scale, is carry out the randomization of how much cash was going out at a area above the village level, what's called the sublocation. And typically in a sublocation, there's something like 10 to 15 villages. So, think of that as a local economic area. And we're going to have some of these local economic areas getting a lot of cash and others getting a lot less cash, and then studying the effects across these sublocations. So that's a really important element of design. If you want to understand aggregate effects, it's much easier to do so when you have variation at this kind of regional level in exposure to the program. Okay. The third element that's really important to keep in mind was this, we were able to carry out really large scale data collection and measurement. We censused all households in this region. And this is a region with about 300,000 individuals. We censused all enterprises in this region. There are about 12,000 non-farm enterprises, and then pretty much every household is a farm enterprise. We're working in rural areas. And we also carried out very detailed price surveys. So, this was like, many years of very detailed data collection with a big team. And, we really, you might say, why did you need so much data? We wanted to basically construct local GDP measures, sublocation by sublocation. And to measure GDP, you've got to measure a lot of things. We have to understand how many enterprises there are, what their profits are, what their earnings are, the wage bill, all these kinds of things. Finally, and something I'll spend a little less time on today, is we also develop a theoretical framework to help us understand the results and think about implications for welfare. I'll talk about this briefly, but in the paper, the Egger et al. Paper, and then in the appendix to that paper, ultimately in the published version, we discuss that theoretical framework a little bit more. Okay. So let me talk about that kind of framing of welfare to start, and then we're going to get into the data. And I will just say that, one of the main insights here is that if we do find spillover effects and multiplier effects of cash, that alone does not prove that there are welfare benefits of the program. Just because there's a multiplier, just because there's more GDP, it might still be the case that welfare hasn't improved by as much as we think. And why is that, or what is the intuition? Welfare is going to be improved when people have more options, when they have a larger budget set. So just because there's a change in spending patterns, let's say, it doesn't necessarily mean they're better off. Imagine that their budget constraint is the same, but the program leads to changes in prices. So we see some changes in consumption patterns. Well, if that's due to changes in prices, it's really unclear if that's a welfare gain. There may also be spillover effects if other people's behavior changes in ways that benefit me. Now that's a little bit more general, but again, in the paper we talk about it. We talk about it more. So again, expanding budget constraints or other people's behavior that generates positive spillovers for me, that's good for welfare. But that also speaks to when, say, a multiplier is not necessarily equivalent to an increase in welfare. In development economics, we put a lot of attention and we focus a lot on per capita consumption expenditures as our measure of well-being. It's hard to characterize what what it means for people to be better off, but one is, if they're eating more, if they're consuming more, we tend to think of that as an improvement in welfare. But in this context, we have to think of some caveats. So, if I'm measuring consumption expenditures and they go up as a result of this program, but they go up at the same rate at which consumer goods prices go up, then there isn't really a real gain in consumption per capita, right? There may be a nominal gain, but not a real gain. So that's going to be very important. There could be price changes, as I mentioned before. We have to try to account for those. Second, I might see that consumption goes up and income goes up in areas getting cash transfers. But if those increases in income are due to, say, big increases in labor supply, I need to factor in the fact that people are working more and consuming less leisure. And so there may be some offsetting effects. I could be working more, but still have lower welfare if I'm losing out on leisure time, right? So that's a second one. The third one is I may be consuming more in the short run, and I might say, wait, look, this program generated this big improvement in welfare, but maybe I'm consuming more because I'm dissaving my assets. I'm like eating down my wealth for whatever reason. In the short run, well, then that's not necessarily going to be equivalent to a long run gain in welfare because I have fewer assets, I have less wealth. Maybe I'm going to consume less tomorrow. So once you think of things in that way, it makes you realize that per capita consumption alone may not be the best measure of welfare because of these offsetting effects. So we really have to measure a lot to understand welfare effects. We have to try to measure labor supply, prices, assets, and kind of go beyond, a simple focus on what is per capita consumption today as a welfare measure. Now, I'm talking about this in the context of spillovers and general equilibrium effects. But I think this point for any of you working in development economics or economics as a whole, this is a very important point. We can't automatically equate consumption with welfare. Okay, so let me just put a couple equations here just to frame thoughts about welfare. Imagine we are considering a household indirect utility function. So this is kind of our measure of their well-being. We'll call that V sub I for household I. And imagine that it is a function of both the transfer that I receive through this program, T sub I, and that could be zero, let's say if I'm in the control group, or it could be something large if I'm in the treatment group. But my utility is also a function of the transfers that other households receive. And just imagine for simplicity that the average transfer that others in my area receive is capital T. Okay, so I may be benefiting or being hurt, whatever the sign is there, due to my own transfers and others' transfers. If we want to kind of, think about the effect of spillovers here and put it in terms of this utility function, I would say, well, my utility V sub I as a function of T sub I comma T, what's on the right there in the middle equation, that's my utility when cash transfers are going out in my area, that may be equivalent to my utility V sub I of T sub I star comma zero. So that's basically my utility when there are spillovers is equivalent to my utility under this alternative transfer T star in a world without spillovers. So again, to the extent that I'm better off because others are getting transfers near me, and that's generating positive, a positive welfare gain for me, then that would be equivalent to T star sub I being greater than T sub I, right? Like that's equivalent to a world, like my utility is the same as it would be in a world where I'm just getting a bigger transfer and others aren't. Okay, so just try to, think of things in that way. This is, we're thinking of things in terms of equivalent variation. Of course, if there's no general equilibrium effects here, then it, basically my utility, whether that T term is equal to T or equal to zero is the same. And then T sub I is equal to T sub I star. Okay, so in a world without spillovers, all that really matters is the transfer that I get and not the spillovers that are going out. Okay, so this is again just a way to kind of frame our thinking about what it means for there to be welfare gains when there's transfers. Okay, so we could go into this even more. This is the last slide on the theory, but I just want to kind of lay it out in a little more detail. We go into much more detail in the appendix of the paper. Again, this is the V sub I term. My indirect utility is basically the outcome of this maximization where I'm maximizing over this vector X sub I. These are choices I'm making. So X sub I is a vector that includes the kinds of goods that I'm consuming, the amount of labor that I'm supplying, et cetera. Think of that as the whole range of my choices. X sub minus I are the choices of other people around me, and those could be affected by the transfer level T that I was talking about before. So I could be affected both directly by my own choices, but also by others' choices if those choices, for instance, generate spillovers, if there's externalities, et cetera. And all of this is subject to my budget constraint. X sub I has to be in the kind of feasible budget set, capital X, which again, that feasible budget set could be a function of the transfers that are going out. Okay, so this is again just a way to frame the issues to the extent that we know that that real budget set is expanding because of the transfers, and I just have more options and more choices, in general, that's going to map into improvements in individual welfare gain. So, that is something that we should think of almost unambiguously as a welfare gain. If I'm more productive because of the transfer and I'm just, I'm earning more, I've greater budget, greater options, that's going to be equivalent to a welfare gain. We can't just look at, consumption alone. We have to look at these other factors. Okay. So I've already stated this point. Let me get into the data, but just want to keep this in mind to think about welfare. So let's turn to the data. We're working in Kenya. We started this project in 2014, and cash transfers really started going out at the very end of 2014 into 2015, 2016. We're working in Siaya County, which you can see here in green on the kind of western side of Kenya, pretty near the border with Uganda and right on Lake Victoria. The setting is rural Siaya. There's about, 100 households per village. The household size is pretty typical for Kenya. There's 4 or 5 household members on average, about half are children. One thing to keep in mind is actually fertility and, fertility rates in Kenya are actually considerably below a lot of other African countries. So it's pretty typical to have 2 or 3 kids. And in some other, say, West African settings today, that would be a pretty low number for households. Because we're working in rural areas, almost all the households are engaged in agriculture, but as we'd expect, many are also in self-employment, in wage work. People are often, in any given year working on have a bunch of different economic activities. Among the respondents we survey, the average age is about 50. They have about 5 years of schooling on average. That was pretty typical for 50-year-olds in rural Kenya 10 years ago. But again, things have changed. And, today schooling levels are just very high in Kenya compared to their neighbors, some of the highest in all of Africa. And, today the median, Kenyan 20-year-old has been to secondary school. So there's been a really big change in schooling levels. The period that we study from 2014 to 2017, mainly in this paper, is actually a kind of nice period to study. It's a period really with a lot of stability. There was kind of steady positive economic growth during this period. It was before the COVID shock. There were no national elections right in that window. So we're studying things in a pretty stable period, and we don't have to worry about as many external shocks during this time point. Okay, so how did the program work? Again, we worked with Give Directly. They're very famous for giving unconditional cash transfers. It's non-governmental, and their goal was to do so in as efficient a way as possible. They try to identify the poor in a very cost-effective way. They use a simple proxy means test at this time in Kenya to do so. They basically looked for households that that had a grass thatched roof. It turns out in the data, those households with grass thatched roofs really are somewhat poorer on average than those with metal roofs. And about a third of households had grass thatched roofs. So they basically identify households in that way, target cash to them. They deliver the cash through mobile money, through the mobile money platform called M-Pesa in Kenya, again, to minimize distribution costs. And then they distribute. It's a one-time transfer in the sense that this isn't universal basic income. It isn't like households are going to be receiving monthly income for years. It's a one-time transfer, but it's just distributed in 3 tranches over 8 months. So, they tell you you're going to receive the transfer. A few weeks later, you get the first tranche, then a second tranche, and then, by 8 months later, you get the last tranche. And what's notable is these are very large transfers. So at the time, they were $1,000 in nominal terms. In PPP terms, in 2015 dollars, it was almost $1,800, $1,900. In today's dollars, it would be over $2,000, given there's been some inflation. And this is equivalent to about 3/4 of measured average household expenditures in this area. So this is like a really big economic shock. Household income is going up by like 75% on average when you get the transfer. And of course, for the poor households, it's more like a doubling or more. And as I mentioned, it's just a very large share of local GDP over the period, in which cash is going out. Okay, so think of this as like a big cash transfer. And the way the randomization was set up, and I already alluded to this, is a bit different than other studies. The randomization wasn't just carried out at the household level or the village level. It was also carried out at this higher level. And hopefully you guys can see this. in total, in the rural areas we worked in Seattle, there were 653 villages divided into 68 sublocations. We're calling them saturation groups here, so about 10 villages per sublocation. They were randomized into two groups. One was the low saturation um, allocation, like it's not quite a control because I'll tell you there is some treatment that goes on there, but and then one is high saturation. What's the difference there? In the low saturation sublocations, in those 35 sublocations, 1/3 of villages in those sublocations received cash transfers, 2/3 were control. In the high saturation sublocations, 2/3 received cash transfers, 2/3 of the villages, and 1/3 were control. So there's just a big difference in the share of villages getting cash in the high versus low saturation sublocations. Okay, so then within each of those sublocations, there's a randomization, and the appropriate proportion of villages gets randomized into treatment and control. And then within, say, the treatment villages, it's the poorer households, the ones with the grass thatched roofs, that end up getting cash. The richer households don't get cash anywhere. It's just the poorer households. In the control villages, no households get cash. So again, in control villages, whether you're, high saturation, low saturation, in the control villages, nobody gets cash. In the treatment villages, the poorer households get cash. That's the way it works. All right. So this is the design. It's a little more complicated than the typical design, but what it does is at this higher level of clusters of villages vary the amount of cash that's going in, and that's going to be very important for us. So this is actually a map of the area. This is Seattle, and you can kind of see the location of treatment villages, the black dots, control villages, the white dots. The gray shaded areas are the gray shaded areas are the high saturation sublocations. So they have more of the treatment villages. The white shaded areas are the low saturation sublocations. They have more of the open circles, more control villages. And then you see some X's, especially in the southern part of the county where we didn't work. Those were villages not in the study sample, but other than some of those X's in the lower part of the map, we were working in almost every village in Seattle. The other place where you see some gaps are around the towns. You see those hash marks, and then some sublocations which are blank, blank white. Those are basically the towns in this area, and they're excluded because we're only working in rural areas. All right. So you can already see if you look at some of these gray areas, there's a lot of black dots. In the white areas, there's fewer black dots. There's more, control villages. But even beyond the high and low saturation sublocations, there's some additional variation and exposure to the program because I may be in a low saturation sublocation, but located right near two high saturation sublocations. So actually a lot of villages around me may actually be treated and vice versa. So there's just a lot of variation in local exposure. It's a pretty densely populated area. You can see even within a few kilometers here, there's many other villages typically of a village. And this is some data on that. The population density is much higher than the Kenyan average, although again, the Kenyan average is kind of brought down by very sparsely populated areas in northern Kenya. Typically within 2 kilometers of a village, there's 8 to 9 other villages. So again, it's very plausible to think that there could be spillovers among neighboring villages. And there's pretty good market access. Typically there's within 2 or 3 kilometers of you, there's a market. And you can kind of see that on the previous slide. Those red stars are the markets. And for most villages, if you walk a couple kilometers, 2 or 3 kilometers, you'll get to a market. So the average walking time was something like 30 minutes. But, and almost everybody is really walking to markets at baseline in 2014, 2015, 2016. Fewer than 10% of households owned a motorcycle or a car at that point in time. So people were walking, maybe they were biking, but you might expect economic activity to be pretty concentrated around your local market if you don't have a car or a motorcycle. And that is what we find. We find that the vast majority of people are buying goods at a market that's within walking distance. Most people, if they have a job, it's within walking distance. When we look at the owners of businesses in a market, the vast majority of them live in that sublocation. So there's a lot of this kind of concentrated local economic activity, as you'd expect in a rural low-income setting. Okay, so this is again the map I just showed you. What I'm going to do is zoom in on that red box you can see there. This is just part of the northern side of the county. And you can see there's kind of a gray sublocation to the left and a white one to the right. Gray is high saturation, so more treatment. This is just zooming in there. And again, you can see that gray area to the left, the white to the right. You can see some treatment villages, some control villages. What I want to do is highlight two villages, two control villages here. So these two control villages are now in blue. They were both open circles. One is in the high saturation area, one is in the low saturation area. You can immediately see a difference here in their local environment. The one on the left, even though it's a control village, because it's in this high saturation area, is basically surrounded by treatment villages. The one on the right, there's some treatment villages nearby, but mainly control villages. So again, these two villages are really near each other. They're only a few kilometers apart. They may have a very different experience in terms of what the cash transfer program is going to mean for local economic activity. What I'm going to do now is kind of think about that local 2 kilometer area around them. And again, we show that most economic activity is occurring within 2 or 3 kilometers in terms of where I go shopping, where I'm working. Again, if I'm counting correctly, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 treated villages within that 2 kilometer radius on the left and only two on the right. Big difference in the amount of cash going into those areas. Let's zoom in again on the left just to kind of highlight the data a little bit more. So again, that blue village sorry, the blue dot there is a control village. There's a bunch of treatment villages around them. What we did in this study is we censused all the households, and I'm just showing you those dots there of households. Some are eligible for the cash. Those are the poor households with grass thatch roofs. Some are ineligible. Those are the light gray households there. But you can see there's a lot of households here, pretty high population density in this area. The red star you see to the top right is a local market, kind of near a road. The yellow is a road. Um, and then the blue triangles here are non-farm enterprises. These could be barber shops, grain mills, carpentry. They could be little stores. Again, you see them really clustered in the top right there around the market, but there are some scattered around. If you look really closely at your screen, even in the rural areas, there are some other non-farm businesses, including some in this control village. So what does the cash transfer program mean for those businesses? Let's say now what I've done here in red is highlight the households that received cash in red. Those are the eligible households in treatment villages. So the blue dot in the middle there, that's a control village. None of the eligible households in that village were getting cash. You can see the black dots there didn't turn red. But if I'm a business in that area, there's tons of red dots around me. There's tons of cash coming into this area. And again, that could just mean a lot more business for me, a lot more sales relative to that other control village that I talked about before. All right. So this is just like a whirlwind that also just shows you something about the data that we have. Because we censused and geotagged every household, every enterprise, and we know if they got cash, et cetera, we can create measures of local exposure to the program in this way. All right. So again, what did we collect? Detailed households. In addition to the censuses, once we censused all the households, we took a representative sample of 8 or 9,000 of them and did very detailed surveys of consumption, of consumption expenditures, earnings, other household outcomes. We had very high survey rates, around 90%. So we were happy with that. We did enterprise surveys. Again, we censused all the enterprises, then we took representative samples of enterprises and collected detailed data on number of workers, profits, revenues, investments, inventory. And we did that both for farm and non-farm enterprises. And then we collected market price surveys across all 61 markets in the area. We gathered data on 72 major commodities and tried to get prices from 3 separate vendors in every market over 30 months. So in total, there's something like 300,000 or 400,000 price observations in the data. So we have very good price data. We then did some separate surveys on local government finance, public finance, local government spending. I'm not going to talk about that today. My co-author, Michael Walker, has been doing some work on that. Okay, so big data enterprise, one of the biggest data collection projects that I've worked on. It took place, over a number of months. If you look kind of from the start to the end, There was data collection going on for about 30 months, with a lot of it kind of focused in this, maybe like 6 to 24 month period. But basically, we're going to have some follow-up data even 2.5 years after cash goes out. All right. So, what are we interested in? We're interested in understanding these GE effects. We're interested in kind of comparing impacts of cash to a world without the intervention, right? That's what we're interested in. Um, and we want to be able to both estimate effects of getting the cash yourself, direct effects, and these spillover effects, neighborhood effects. What we're going to find, and I don't have time to get into all the econometrics, is as we kind of suspected, effects are quite concentrated within a few kilometers around um, households. So when cash goes in, we do see spillover effects, but they're pretty concentrated, mainly within 2 kilometers, sometimes out to 4 kilometers. And we basically, establish that econometrically. Um, we are going to estimate effects taking into account all the variation in the cash that's going out. That's approach one. But we're also going to estimate effects in a more reduced form sense, relying very heavily on the research design of high versus low saturation sublocations, and then treatment versus control villages. So there's kind of those two designs. And let me just show you a couple estimation equations, and I'm going to quickly run you through the results. An outcome here, say Y, could be household per capita consumption for household I and village V. That is affected by both the amount of cash going into my village V, and that's the first term, the beta times amount sub V, plus any effects of cash going into other villages out to some radius capital R away from me. Now, in the data, when we look at where the effects go out to, they typically only go out to about 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers when we test that. So we're basically going to have a beta term for the effect of local cash, and then a beta sub R term, or beta sub 2 out to 2 kilometers in most cases. We control for baseline values of outcomes where we have them. That's the Y IV comma T equals 0 term. So this is kind of an ANCOVA specification when we have those measures, and we deal with missing values in various ways. Okay, so this is the basic specification, kind of almost like a classic spillover style estimation. We're going to instrument for the amount that goes in to these villages with the treatment indicator for the village, treat sub V, as well as the share of eligible households, cash eligible households within different radii. The instrumental variable, the instruments are very strong. Give directly very much complied with the randomization plan that we provided them. So we have first stage F statistics of 100, 200, 300. So whether you look at, if you were just to put treatment on the right-hand side rather than the amount that goes in, you'd have very similar results, just kind of rescaled. Okay, so that's one, kind of approach to get the average treatment effects. Let me just skip forward because I realize I only have another 10 minutes. The second approach is more of this reduced form ITT style experiment. And again, this should be very familiar, to you. The left-hand side term here again could be a consumption measure. It could be a enterprise outcome measure, and that is going to be a function of the treatment status of the village, and alpha 1 times treat V plus whether you're in a high or a low saturation sublocation. So this is kind of a more reduced form way of getting at local spillovers rather than just the total local density of cash going in within a radius. This is saying, am I in a high or low saturation sublocation? So again, this is a little bit more of a traditional approach. The first one takes into account all the spatial variation. All right. Hopefully, for people familiar with RCTs, this kind of specification is sensible. So what I'm going to do is very quickly is go through the main results and get to the kind of multiplier. What we're able to do in this paper, really because of the data, is just measure the quantities of interest and try to trace out what happens. So cash goes out. We first look at what happens to recipient households. We document actually in this setting that the marginal propensity to consume is very high. So then we look at what happens to local enterprises where they're spending the money, what happens to their revenue, what happens to their profits. And then we look at non-recipient households because many of them are either owners of those local businesses or they're employed in those local businesses, so they could be benefiting. Then we look at local prices. And finally, we construct the multiplier. I'm going to do this a little bit quickly just to give you guys a flavor of what is going on. And So it adds up to the multiplier. I don't have time today, but in the paper, we also look at a bunch of non-market outcomes, both within the household, what I was calling category one outcomes before, and broader things like public goods and attitudes that you could think of as category three outcomes in my delineation right up front in the lecture. So I won't have time for the category one and three today, but they're in the paper. We discuss them in the chapter as well. Okay, so let's start with the recipient household. And what I want you to do is just focus on the top row. There's a lot here. Focus on the top row and focus on columns 1 and 2. Those are the two different regression specifications that I showed you. One is just more the reduced form, that's column 1. The other is the total effect using all the spatial variation, column 2. What you can see is consumption expenditures by recipient households goes up a lot, $293, and our preferred specification is column 2, $338 per capita. So big increase per household, sorry. Big increases in consumption. Not surprisingly, households got the cash, they spent it, very high marginal propensity to consume of like 0.8 in the first year. So not surprisingly, consumption goes up. And if you look at the categories below, it kind of goes up for food, it goes up for non-food, big increases in consumption. Okay, that's not surprising. There's some indication in the top row here of some increases in household income also for these households. So it isn't like they got the cash and they started earning less. If anything, they're earning a bit more. This is something that surprises labor economists. In US labor or public finance or, people studying Europe, they tend to think, well, if you give people social insurance, they're just going to be lazy and stay at home. In development, it's the opposite. In development, study after study shows when you give people cash transfers and other forms of assistance, it kind of unlocks a lot of possibilities. The other thing I want to briefly mention is the second row, which is the net value of household transfers received or sent or received. So it could go either way. They're very close to zero here. So effects that we're documenting are not just I got cash and then I just transferred it to my friends. There isn't a ton of changes in the amount of transfers going in and out of households in treatment areas here. Maybe because there were so many cash transfers going out. Maybe I was the only one getting cash. People would sort of, hit me up for that money. But there's so much cash going into these areas, there really isn't a big change in transfers. Okay, so recipient households benefit. What about local enterprises? And here, I want you to focus on the top few rows. The first row, again, focus on column 2 for simplicity here. I guess columns 2 and 3 are both useful. There's some indication that profits go up, but not by a ton. What does go up a lot is enterprise revenue. So again, focus on column 2 just to focus on one number. What column 2 is saying when you look at enterprise revenue is, and all of these are in per household terms, basically revenue in local enterprises goes up by $322 per household. We divide by the number of households in the village. If you remember from the previous slide, household spending went up by $338 per household. So it's almost one-to-one. We're measuring things basically over the last year in both of these cases, sometimes over the last month, sometimes over the last year. We kind of create common units over the last year. It's almost dollar for dollar. When we measure the amount of spending that households are making, the increase in treatment areas, it lines up almost one-to-one with the increase in revenue received by local firms. So this is really reassuring for us that we're capturing what's going on. Revenue goes up. The other thing I want you to note is the wage bill goes up. If you look in column 2, you see that increase in the wage bill by $75.99. So these folks are earning more revenue. There's some indication profits are going up a little bit, $55, and they're also paying more wages. So other local workers could be benefiting in treatment areas. Okay, there's also some increases in enterprise inventory, which is suggestive of investment, maybe a small increase in the number of enterprises. Again, local enterprises are benefiting. Okay, recipient households get the money, they spend it, they consume more. Local enterprises revenue goes up almost dollar to dollar with the local recipients. What about the non-recipient households? And again, here just focus on the top row for simplicity, columns 2 or 3 here. Column 3. These are the non-recipient households. Look at column 3, the top row. Their consumption expenditures are also going up a lot by about 300 something dollars. Now you may say to yourself, wow, that's really impressive. There's a big spillover here on consumption. Why is the dollar amount almost the same for the non-recipients and the recipients? Some of this has to do with the timing. As I mentioned before, a lot of the data collection is going on between 12 to 24 months after the cash goes out. So some of the consumption effect among recipients isn't even all the initial cash transfer they're spending. It's also, it's partially the cash, it's partially due to higher income. But by this, 1 to 2 years later, the non-recipient households consumption has gone up a lot too, and it kind of looks similar to the recipients, but pretty sizable increases of like 13% in the consumption of non-recipient households. Really big increase in their consumption. Again, I won't go through all the other rows here. There's a lot to go through, and in the paper we go through it in a lot of detail. If you look at column 3 again, you can see the income of those non-recipient households goes up by 200 something dollars as well. So really the consumption is being driven mainly by probably by these income gains. And if you scroll down to the bottom couple rows, you see some of this is due to higher profits, probably $36 in higher profits, but a lot of it is due to higher wage earnings. So remember I showed you in the enterprise data that the wage bill went up a lot. Well, this is being reflected in the wage earnings of non-recipient households as well. All right. So we've very quickly here traced out the money goes out, recipients spend it, enterprises have more revenue, they pay more wage bill to their employees. Those employees then consume more themselves. So we're really tracing out the benefits for the local economy. What I want to say here, and again, I only have a few minutes left till I want to open for questions, we don't find very much in the way of price inflation. We find small positive effects when more cash is going out in a given area, prices go up by a little, but typically by less than 1%. This has been really interesting for us. We actually have a follow-up paper, which is an NBR working paper, trying to understand this basically, where we document that one possible explanation for why there was an increase in local production, right? Increase in local revenue and spending without much inflation is due to the fact that there was quite sizable underutilization of inputs, capital and labor inputs at baseline in these rural areas. There was a lot of slack, as it's called, or some people in macro call it. So when there was the local aggregate demand shock due to the cash transfer, a lot of enterprises were able to expand production without having to raise prices, without bidding up prices very much. But again, pretty striking result that these gains I'm showing you are real gains. They're not just due to price inflation. That was one of our concerns, early on in thinking about, consumption measures. Okay, so real gains. And let me just skip this table for the interest of time, and I'm going to culminate here with the transfer multiplier. What we can do now, because we've censused all the households, all the enterprises, and then done these detailed surveys, is kind of add up all the income in treatment and control areas and add up all the consumption in treatment and control areas and create two measures of a multiplier, one income-based, one consumption-based. This is often how GDP measures are constructed. You can either kind of look at the income side or the consumption side. You could also look separately at value add, which we don't do here. We look at consumption and income across all the enterprises and all the households that we have and see how it relates to local economic activity. We do this over the 30 months after the transfer went out. Remember, I told you data collection continued for about 30 months. We kind of integrate up any increase in GDP in treated areas where more cash went out, using kind of similar specifications to come up with a multiplier. Economic theory, macro theorists, the Farhi and Werner handbook chapter is a great reference if you're interested in local multipliers. Actually say that our setting is a setting where we would expect big multipliers. We're a closed local, largely closed local economy. A lot of consumption is just of local goods, local food, local services. That's what closed means. They're receiving an external transfer. So it's not like they're taxing themselves to then spend on transfers. These are like external transfers from the outside. So you wouldn't have Ricardian equivalence type effects or offsetting effects due to a higher tax burden for some taxpayers. So external transfers. They're incomplete markets, which make it harder to save. There's less credit going around. It's harder to smooth. And a very large share of what are called hand-to-mouth consumers, people who get cash and spend. So like literally for these four factors, we would expect there to be large multipliers in this area. And again, the marginal propensity to consume, it depends on how we measure it. It can really be anywhere between 0.7 and 0.9 within the first year, depending on how you consider. But say 0.7 to 0.8 would be a natural marginal propensity to consume. In the basic Keynesian macro models you learned in Econ 1, The kind of simplest transfer multiplier you would imagine would be the marginal propensity to consume divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So that would predict a marginal propensity to consume of maybe around 3 or something like that here. Okay, so what do we find in practice? Let me just get to the results. What we have here are the multiplier estimates. And I want you to look at where it says panel A expenditure multiplier. That's based on consumption. You see that 2.58 number. That's the kind of consumption side multiplier. And then the income multiplier is the 2.47. They're very close. They're both around 2.5. In fact, we take the average below, and the average is 2.52. Again, it's very reassuring. The consumption measures in the household and enterprise surveys are distinct from the income measures in those surveys. They're like different variables, but they're adding up to basically almost an identical value of a multiplier of 2.5. What that means is for every dollar of cash that goes in, GDP over the next 30 months goes up by $2.5. So the initial dollar and an additional dollar and a half. And these are in real terms. Again, there's very little price inflation, so real and nominal are close. But think of this as a real transfer multiplier of about 2.5. So this is larger than estimates in other places. And if we're thinking about social protection programs, back to the point of this lecture, what we're saying here is spending on this social protection program doesn't just benefit recipients, it's increasing local GDP by a lot. This is a meaningful multiplier. And this is just to kind of wrap up with the last figure. This is just showing the data, graphically. On the left is the consumption expenditure multiplier. In the middle in blue is the income multiplier. What we have on the top is quarter by quarter. What is the multiplier that we get, which is really just integrating the bottom panel. The bottom panel shows quarter by quarter what is the excess consumption in yellow. In the middle, what is the excess income in blue? If you integrate those up over time, you get the yellow and purple curves in the top. By the time you get to about 27, 30 months out, you're at a multiplier of about 2.5. Okay, so that's really the kind of culmination of this this paper. I'm just going to go to a kind of concluding slide here. What did we find here? We're interested in social protection. There's cash transfer programs all over the world. What are they doing? Well, at least in this setting, they didn't just benefit the recipients, they generated spillover gains for local enterprises, other local households. There wasn't a ton of inflation in this setting, and the aggregate multiplier is really large. So again, to the extent that these results travel elsewhere, it suggests that social protection programs could really stimulate the local economy. But external validity is very important. And let me just leave it off here as the final bullet. In other settings where there's a lower marginal propensity to consume, maybe richer settings where there's fewer hand-to-mouth consumers, you might not expect as much of a multiplier. In settings where the cash transfer is being spent based on tax revenue that's being collected, well, the tax revenue that's being collected is going to dampen some of the local stimulus. So actually, I mentioned this follow-on paper looking at Slack and trying to understand what's going on really with these multipliers. There we do some simulations looking at other settings, settings with different marginal propensity to consume, urban settings, settings with less slack, so better utilized inputs at baseline. And you would see, in all those cases, you would see smaller multipliers than the 2.5 here. That said, there's plenty of poor rural areas and low and middle income countries that look a lot like rural Kenya, where you might expect to see big multipliers. Okay, so let me leave it there. I think I'm exactly at an hour, and I'm happy to go for 20 or 30 minutes with questions if there's anything that folks want to talk about.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Ted. I'll first open it up to anybody that's a live participant. If you want to raise your hand, we can call on you. But if not, we have, I think, 30 plus questions in the chat that we can work through. Maybe I
Do you
will.
want me to look at them, or should I be looking at the Q&A, or would you want to, Caleb? There's a
Um,
lot of questions, so I'm happy
yeah,
for you to filter them if you want, or
I think that might be easiest.
okay.
You're welcome to take a look though. Let's start though, perhaps just with something from the chat. There are a few questions on multiplier effects. So Samira asked, which channels seem most important for non-recipient households? Local demand shocks, wage spillovers, or credit market responses? And
Yeah.
someone else asked, could part of this be explained by household composition changes or marriage market responses?
Great question. Let me start with the second one just because it's fresh. We do look a lot at household composition. We track these households. We collected panel data. We wanted to know if households were moving. We wanted to know if people individuals were moving in and out of households or the whole household was moving. And over this initial 30-month period, we don't see substantial changes there. So that's pretty interesting. Over time, we've continued tracking these households. We are starting to see some more migration responses in the longer term, but in the short run, not much in the way of household, composition changes. We haven't done yet a full marriage market analysis, but it's something on our agenda, and I think it's a really interesting question. There was the first question I think related to like where are the gains for non-recipients coming from? It's really a combination of effects. I kind of quickly went through a few tables at the end. There's some indication that local wages do go up. So that's part of the story for why people are earning more. But there's also, an increase in employment in firms in treatment areas. So like the wage bill is going up for some combination of increased employment and wages going up. Um, so, there is a shift that we actually see towards non-farm enterprises. So there's a bit of a sectoral shift that's part of the story. Wages are going up, that's part of the story. And even though they're not quite significant, for owners of enterprises, profits are going up. So it isn't just one thing, but it's, the earnings for non-recipients are going up due to some combination of higher enterprise profits, higher wages, and then a shift towards the, employment in non-farm enterprises. And they kind of add up to these pretty substantial effects.
Wonderful. I'll give another chance to the live attendees if you want to raise a hand. Otherwise, we're up to 40 questions in the chat. Okay, Mabel, go for it.
Yes, thank you. So, looking at the increase in the informal sector in most countries in Africa. So, the last statement was saying if there's a few people in the urban areas with hand to mouth, the multiplier effects could be lower, the MPC could be lower. So
Yeah.
are we saying that in African countries, mostly where there now is informal sector, whereby the traders or those employed in the informal sector, you've got the hand to mouth model in terms of like they sell during the morning up to evening, then that profit, they just buy food. So are we saying the MPC could be lower for a country? Let's say there's 80-20, the formal sector is 20 and the 80% is mostly informal. Thank you.
It's a great question. I think in general, and it's a finding across the world, not just in African settings, as people get richer, the marginal propensity to consume from a transfer like this would fall. And so, to the extent that in urban areas, people working in formal enterprises are richer, they're better off, they're going to tend to be saving more of this kind of transfer, whereas poor people will consume more. And in general, rural areas are just much poorer than urban areas. So it's not to say that there isn't an informal sector in cities. There's a huge informal sector. There's a lot of poverty in cities, but the share of poor is even higher in rural areas. And certainly in our data, we find these really high marginal propensities to consume. People really, within a year of getting the transfer, are spending the vast majority of it. As countries get richer and more urban, et cetera, you might expect smaller sort of stimulus type effects of a cash transfer just because people are saving more of it. They're kind of less right on the margin of subsistence. Yeah.
Thank
That
you.
links to oh, sorry. Thanks, Mabel, for your question. That links to one other question that I saw about external validity, not just in the urban setting, but about linkages to climate shocks. The question is that are the general equilibrium effects likely to be different when transfers arrive in a lean versus post-harvest season, or if there's features built in to these programs that can build resilience to climate shocks? So give you,
That is such a great question. And I think for me, I would love to kind of think through exactly how cash transfers can be adapted in a world with really big climate shocks. Um, if you're interested in how social protection programs or interventions can differ in kind of lean and non-lean seasons, I want to point you to that Breeza et al. Paper that was on one of my early slides. It's really a labor intervention in India, but they're just very different effects of social programs, labor programs, and cash programs in lean and non-lean seasons. So yes, I think that's a great point. You could imagine the marginal propensity to consume is very different. In a lean season, people are, basically the marginal utility of consumption is extremely high, and you'd expect people to really be consuming that cash transfer immediately. In our data, we did look at kind of hungry season versus non-hungry season effects. We don't see huge effects, but remember, this was a period of pretty good economic performance and stability. There were no uh, so, um, but yes, I think in general that general line of thinking about how we can adapt cash transfer programs in a world with a changing climate is important. And maybe in some settings, the best thing to do is to transfer cash in the lean season, and maybe in other settings it isn't. So yeah, thanks for thinking about that. I don't have too much to say here other than I'm very sympathetic to that as a first order policy issue and research issue.
thank you. Juan, would you like to go ahead?
Hey, Juan.
Yes, sure. Hi. Yeah, that was a very interesting topic. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. I think that was really very clear and compact when you say that, when you say how these local effects can transform like in aggregate effects in the GDP, and that was a really interesting and very
Thank you.
good results, I think, from my perspective. So I'm just want to ask you one question or maybe a suggestion. I have already, I'm already working in a paper that is called like that use a general equilibrium model, but for the term instruction of interest rates in emerging
Mm,
economies. So
mm,
I used to think that most of the emerging economies, they have more social programs than advanced economies. So I'm just wondering, is that correct, or do you have any uh, points that you would like me to advise in order to have a more clear picture about this? So I would really appreciate your help. And yeah, as I said,
yeah,
your yeah, that research was very interesting. Um, it was
thanks.
amazing.
Thank you. I,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Oh, thanks so much. It really depends so much from country to country. So even thinking about the East Africa region that I'm talking about, within neighboring countries of Kenya, there's such a huge, amount of variation in the number of social programs that different countries have. If you compare even Rwanda and Burundi, neighboring countries, radically different social policy, economic policy, or Kenya to South Sudan. So, it's very hard to characterize and say whether poor countries have more social programs than rich countries. But I think overall, rich countries have much more developed social protection programs. Like I mentioned, if we look at old age pensions and old age healthcare, which is most spending in rich countries on social programs, go to those old age programs. They're so much better developed in rich countries than poor countries. Just the magnitude of those transfers, the magnitude of the spending on health. So countries like Kenya are trying right now to expand their old age pension programs and health insurance programs, but they're starting from a very low level. And again, even I mentioned this at the top, even middle income Asian countries like India and China that are considerably richer than Kenya do not have very well developed old age pension programs, or they exist, but they're not well funded. So, it depends on the country, and there are some middle income countries with lots of really good social programs. If I think in South America, I would say, countries like Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, there are countries that have like very well developed social programs, even as middle income countries, but some of their neighbors, much less. So I think the difference is in rich countries, almost universally, there's very well established social protection programs. And in middle income and low countries, it could be very high, it could be very low. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I understood your
Yes.
question.
Yeah. Thank you. And I just want to ask you just a little, yeah. And
Yeah.
do you think that there is a link between social programs and the term structure? And the financial sector. I mean, is that from
I
your
mean, there has to be,
experience?
and I feel like that would be one of those very deep effects. But social programs are going to affect all kinds of macro quantities. Like I was just showing here, right? Like the expansion of cash led to GDP effects, et cetera. The same is definitely going to be true for social programs like old age pensions. And so they may, impact how resilient the economy is to shocks. They may affect volatility. And then all those things are going to affect financial markets. So I think on some level, the answer has to be yes, but it's going to depend on the program, the size of the program. I don't know if I have a great answer other than it almost has to affect the financial sector, a large scale social program.
Okay, thank you so much
Yeah.
for your answer.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Juan. There's a question from Patso on how we should think about leakages outside the treatment area when calculating multipliers, and there's a couple of
Yeah.
variations of leakages in the chat. So
Yeah.
maybe we want to touch
So
on that.
great question. And, in the paper, we have, quite a bit of discussion on this. And I had a slide that I went through quickly on this. To the extent that people are consuming goods produced elsewhere, that there's a lot of imports from outside the study area, then we might be overstating the multiplier. The flip side of that is to the extent that um, some people are working outside the study area rather than inside the study area, or there's a change in working in treatment villages versus control villages that could understate the multiplier. So we kind of work out, you know, basically we're only measuring things in this county, and there could be stuff going on, imports coming in or labor coming in or out. All those things could be affecting the multiplier. What we try to do in the paper is bound those effects. We have some estimates of the extent of imports. And so, you know, we basically address that. That makes the multiplier a little bit smaller, et cetera. So yeah, it's an important issue. We don't measure those things as well in this data. Actually, we've done some subsequent rounds of measurement in this area to try to get at long run multipliers. We haven't published those yet, but in those later rounds, we did a better job of measuring imported goods or, again, labor that's living outside the study area and working inside the study area, et cetera. So yeah, very good question. It's kind of a measurement issue, but we feel like the basic theme of a multiplier greater than 2 holds even if we were to deal with the imports from outside the study area. So yeah, thanks for asking that question. That's like a fundamental issue on measurement here.
Yeah, good core question. Um, there's one from Celine that just came in that says that it was interesting to see increases in household income so much. And the question is whether were clear shifts across different types of income generating activities, or if households became more productive within the same activities, if you have a sense for that.
Yeah, so we really do see a shift from agricultural employment to non-agricultural employment. We do see a basically increase in treatment areas in employment in non-agricultural enterprises. And it makes sense. I mean, people are getting this cash transfer. It's a big local aggregate demand shock, and they're spending it locally. And I'll give you an example. There's local shops that are stocking goods that people will go to. There are local carpenters or other trades. And as I have more money, I may want to do some improvements on my home, right? I'm going to be spending there. So employment will go up there. There's also local grain mills, and local grain mills are important in this area because transport costs are pretty high, roads aren't good, people don't have cars. So they take their grain in bulk to a local mill that mills it into flour, which then they use for food. And so every village kind of has these local little mechanized mills. Those guys are going to be busier too. If people are either producing more food or buying more grain, they're going to be milling it. So it kind of makes sense intuitively, but we really do see a lot of increase in revenue in non-ag employment, retail sector, local manufacturing, all of them. and a shift out of agriculture. It's kind of interesting that this social protection program, this cash transfer program, is almost generating like a mini structural transformation towards non-ag. One of the things we're doing is, as I mentioned, looking at longer run effects, and we haven't published those yet, but we're finding some indication that even 5 to 7 years after the cash transfer, there is an increase in economic activities in the treatment areas that got cash. And again, if these businesses are just doing better, getting more revenue for a year or two, and the cash is going in, they could make investments that allow them, or maybe new enterprises arise, and those could lead to some persistent changes in the local economic geography. So that's kind of like the next step in the agenda. But there is a shift into non-agricultural employment.
Perfect. Another alternate back to the panel. If anyone else has a question here, I can see that a few of you put questions into the chat, but it'd be great if you're willing, if you would just raise your hand and ask it live. Yeah, Sushma, go ahead.
Thank you, Miguel, for the lecture. I don't know how much I could grasp that lecture of yours because theoretical is not my core area. But what I understand is because I'm working on the informal workers. I'm from India. I think you can perceive that. So I'm trying to work on the informal workers, social exclusion portion, where I'm taking in the awareness and the 5 ways awareness applicability, or affordability and eligibility, applicability, and all that aspects. So when you talk about this kind of social security, social protection programs, how much is it, once you can go by defined as you go, or contribution system, like how it can be sustainable for a country like India, where 90% of your workers are informally employed, and the government
Yeah.
concern, be it at the central level or at the local level, they don't give much when I think process into the policies that they make. It's just for a namesake, there was a policy, it came, unorganized social sector bill in 2008, but it didn't fructify into something very effective implementation. That means it's just for, okay, now recently, and the forms have changed so much, right? Now they have these gig workers and all that thing.
Right. Right.
One of the state like Rajasthan came up with their own, policies like gig workers platform and all that. How is it
It's such,
sustainable? Yeah.
yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, I think the model we have in mind in a lot of low and middle income countries is, like you said, a contributory, say, pension system. And
Mm-hmm.
people who are in the formal sector, they're contributing, the government's matching, and then they have a pension in old age. And that
Mm-hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
system, even in countries like Kenya, which are like India, mainly informal sector, in the formal sector, people get those pensions. Fine. I think in a low and middle income setting where most people are informal, a lot of people are in rural areas, there's people in the gig economy now. We have to think of a different model. There has to be something
Exactly.
more like a universal old age pension
Mm-hmm.
funded through general tax revenue. And I think here, and I talk a little bit about it in the chapter, the South Africa case is actually a great example. That's a middle income country. And after apartheid, they instituted a universal old age pension for everybody over age 60 or over age 65. And it wasn't tested on, did you contribute into the system earlier on? You have to find revenue sources for that. Because if you don't do that, then the old folks in the farm sector, in the informal sector, people who are working in the gig economy who are getting older, they're not going to get pensions, right? They're literally not
Exactly.
going to contribute in the formal sector. So we can't necessarily just build out the formal sector and accommodate more and more people. In some middle income countries, that's what they've done. So in Latin American countries, which are a bit richer, quite a bit richer, many of them than India, they've basically taken that contributory system and just built it out, expanded the formal sector, and now most people are covered through formal pensions. I don't see that working over the next 10 or 20 years in poor sub-Saharan African or South Asian countries. I think we need a different model that's more universal. That's my take.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sushma. Christian, wonderful. I was about to read out your question, but if you'd like to pitch it, that's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening from Kigali, Rwanda. my question was somehow taken on. It's about how the general equilibrium effects can be also associated or being applied effectively in the neighborhood countries, because sometimes a country can be having willingness to work, another one also have also some difficulties, and as you know, sometimes it is difficult to trade with the country which does not have really a good security. And again,
Yeah.
the social protection also in those countries which are also having some issues, also those people, it's difficult because some people they say, oh no, this is money laundering. Sometimes if you do some cash transfer or something like that. So what can be a good practice, like a recommendation to be implied? Because both countries, either the one which is having the willingness or the other one which is also suffering from the other policies which are not really correct. Thank you very much.
If I'm understanding your point, Christian, it's actually a very interesting point. If I think of a sub-Saharan African country, most countries like Rwanda are fairly small. They're very much influenced by the economic policy and social protection programs of their neighbors. If there's protection that promote economic development and stability, that has huge implications for neighbors. So if social protection program means country A is less likely to have conflict, it affects all their neighbors, right? So, it's a very deep point. I think it's something we don't think about that much in development economics, which is kind of like in the African setting, like regional initiatives. I know there's some bodies that think about that, but in the research community, we don't think about it much. But the economic policy of Burundi affects Rwanda, the economic policy of Rwanda affects Tanzania, et cetera. And to the extent that there are good social protection programs that promote stability and growth, they could really help their neighbors as well. There are big spillovers in terms of trade, labor. So very deep point, and one that's not usually on the agenda of development economists, but very important. It's almost like the intersection of international trade and development economics, what you're saying. So I'm interested in, and I wish people study that more.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We look forward to the work that you're gonna do on that, Christian. I'll layer migration onto this intersection that we've just talked about. Eric was wondering if there's a good social protection program in one locality, if there is migration into that locality to benefit from the social protection program. This could be across national borders. If there's also examples that you know of these programs being rolled out at a lower, like subnational level, and seeing shifts there, that would also be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it'll always depend on the kind of migration regulations, et cetera. But one thing I can say, I mentioned that we're doing these like 5 to 7 year follow-ups, and now we're even doing a 10-year follow-up in this population. One thing that we are finding is the areas that had received the large cash transfers, 5 to 7 years later, those villages have higher populations. And we're just doing the analysis now, but it seems like a bunch of that is people moving into these areas because there's more economic activity in those areas. So that again could lead to some kind of sustainable, long run kind of change in the local economic geography because of this social protection program. And this was just a one-time cash transfer, right? And already we're seeing persistent effects. So it seems very plausible that longer term programs that are generous could lead to migration effects. Again, are people migrating to get access to a program? It'll really depend if, let's say, I'm a foreigner in a country, do I even have access to that program or not? I think, what we're finding in Kenya is people are moving into those areas just because of the increased economic activity, even though they're not getting the cash. So I think it's a fascinating thing. And, maybe if there's this course in a few years, we'll have some of those results and I can report them to you about the longer term effects. But at least so far, it looks like there are persistent migration effects through the program.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. People could move in for the program or to benefit from the effects of the program in
Right.
terms of the economic activity. Long term, it could be that there's maybe a bump in a birth rate or who knows what.
Yeah.
I'd love to, in a few years, see the results of that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, everyone, we are at time, but please join me in thanking Ted Miguel for his time and his expertise and all of these insights. I think we've had more interaction, I think, on this call than a mini. So really appreciate everything that you've shared with us. We will, of course, come back for our last lecture next week, and we hope to see everyone there.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.